narrating with you the chapters. But the wind changed and she had to go. So what we're going to do, I thought, is we're going to read the last couple chapters together. So chapter 10 today, we're going to, I think, just read chapter 10 because it is a long chapter. So chapter 10 is called Full Moon. All day long, Mary Poppins had been in a hurry, and when she was in a hurry, she was always cross. Everything Jane did was bad. Everything Michael did was worse. She even snapped at the twins. Jane and Michael kept out of her way as much as possible, for they knew that there were times when it was better not to be seen or heard by Mary Poppins. I wish we were invisible, said Michael, when Mary Poppins had told him that the very sight of him was more than any self-respecting person could be expected to stand. We shall be, said Jane. If we go behind the sofa, we can count money in our money boxes, and she might be better after she's had some supper. So they did that. 6 pence and 4 pennies, that's 10 pence. And a halfpenny and a 3-penny bit, said Jane, counting up quickly. 4 pennies and 3 farthings, and that's all, said Michael, putting his money in a little heap. That'll do nicely for the poor box, said Mary Poppins, looking over the arm of the sofa and sniffing. Oh, no, said Michael. It's for myself. I'm saving. For one of those aeroplanes, I suppose, said Mary Poppins scornfully. No, for an elephant. A private one for myself, like Lizzie at the zoo. I could take you for rides then, said Michael, half looking, half not looking at her to see how she would take it. Said Mary Poppins. What an idea. But they could see she wasn't quite as cross as before. I wonder, said Michael thoughtfully, what happens in the zoo at night when everyone's gone home? Care killed a cat, snapped Mary Poppins. I wasn't caring. I was only wondering, said Michael. Do you know? He inquired of Mary Poppins, who was whisking the crumbs off the table in double-quick time. One more question from you, and spit-spot to bed you go, she said, and began to tidy the nursery so busily that she looked more like a whirlwind in a cap and apron than a human being. It's no good asking her. She knows everything, but she never tells us, said Jane. What's the good of knowing if you can't tell anyone, said Michael, but he did it under his breath so that Mary Poppins couldn't hear. Jane and Michael could never remember having been put to bed so quickly as they were that night. Mary Poppins blew out the light very early and went away as hurriedly as though all the winds of the world were blowing behind her. It seemed to them that they had been there no time. However, when they heard a voice, low whispering at the door, Hurry, Jane and Michael, said the voice. Get things on and hurry. They jumped out of their beds, surprised and startled. Come on, said Jane. Something's happening. And she began to rummage for some clothes in the darkness. Hurry, called the voice again. Oh dear, all I can find is my sailor hat and a pair of gloves, said Michael, running around the room, pulling at drawers and feeling along shelves. Those will do. Put 'em on. It isn't cold. Come on. Jane herself had only been able to find a little coat of John's, but she squeezed her arms into it and opened the door. There was nobody there, but they seemed to hear something hurrying down the stairs. Jane and Michael followed. Whatever it was or whoever it was kept continually in front of them. They never saw it, but they had the distinct sensation of being led on by something that constantly beckoned them to follow. Presently they were in the lane, their slippers making a soft hissing noise on the pavement as they scurried along. Hurry, urged the voice again from a nearby corner. When they turned, they could still see nothing. They began to run hand in hand, following the voice down the streets, through alleyways, under arches, and across parks until, panting and breathless, they were brought to a standstill beside a large turnstile in a wall. Here you are, said the voice. Where? Said Michael. But there was no reply. Jane moved towards the turnstile, dragging Michael by the hand. Look, she said. Don't you see where we are? It's the zoo. A very bright full moon was shining in on the sky, and by its light Michael examined the iron grating and looked through the bars. Of course. How silly of him not to know it was the zoo. But how should we get in? He said. We have no money. That's right, said a deep, gruff voice from within. Special visitors allowed in free tonight. Push the wheel, please. Jane and Michael pushed, and were through the turnstile in a second. "Here's your ticket," said the gruff voice, and looking up they found that it came from a huge brown bear who was wearing a coat with brass buttons and a peaked cap on his head. In his paw were 2 pink tickets, which he held out to the children. "But we usually give tickets," said Jane. "Usual is as usual does. Tonight you'll receive them," said the bear, smiling. Michael had been regarding him closely. "I remember you," he said to the bear. "I once gave you a tin of golden syrup." "That you did," said the bear, "and you forgot to take the lid off. Do you know, I was more than 10 days working at that lid. Be careful in the future." "But why aren't you in your cage?" "Are you always out at night?" said Michael. "No, only when the birthday falls on full moon. But you must excuse me, I have to attend the gate." And the bear turned away and began to spin the handle of the turnstile again. Jane and Michael, holding their tickets, walked into the zoo grounds. In the light of full moon, every tree and flower and shrub were visible. They could see the houses and cages quite clearly. "There seems to be a lot going on," said Michael. And indeed there was. Animals were running about in all paths, sometimes accompanied by birds, and sometimes alone. 2 wolves ran past the children, talking eagerly to a very tall stork, who was now tiptoeing between them with dainty, delicate movements. Jane and Michael distinctly caught the words birthday and full moon as they went by. In the distance, 3 camels were strolling along side by side, and not far away a beaver and an American vulture were deep in conversation, and they all seemed to the children to be discussing the same subject. "Whose birthday is it, I wonder?" said Michael. But Jane was moving ahead, gazing at a curious sight. Just by the elephant stand, a very large, very fat old gentleman was walking up and down on all 4s, and on his back, on 2 small parallel seats, were 8 monkeys going for a ride. "Why, it's all upside down," said Jane. The old gentleman gave her an angry look as he went past. "Upside down," he snorted. "Me? Upside down? Certainly not. Gross insult." The 8 monkeys laughed rudely. "Oh, please, I didn't mean you, but the whole thing," explained Jane, hurrying after him to apologize. "On ordinary days, the animals carry human beings, and now there's a human being carrying the animals. That's all I meant." But the old gentleman, shuffling and panting, insisted that he had been insulted, and hurried away with the monkeys screaming on his back. Jane saw it was no good following him, so she took Michael's hand and moved onwards. They were startled when a voice almost at their feet hailed them. "Come on, you 2. In you come. Let's see you dive for a bit of orange peel you don't want." It was a bitter, angry voice, and looking down they saw it came from a small black seal who was leering at them from a moonlit pool of water. "Come on now. Now, let's see how you like it," he said. But we can't swim," said Michael. "Can't help that," said the seal. "You should have thought of that before. No one ever bothers to find out whether I can swim or not. Isn't that right? What's that?" "Who?" said the first seal. "Speak up." He heard the last question to another seal who was emerged from the water and was whispering. The second seal whispered again. Jane caught the words special visitors, friends of, and then no more. The first seal disappointed, but he said politely enough to Jane and Michael. "Oh, beg your pardon. Pleased to meet you. Beg your pardon." And he held out his flipper and shook hands limply with them both. "Look where you're going, can't you?" he shouted as something bumped into Jane. She turned quickly and gave a little frightened start as she beheld an enormous lion. The eyes of the lion brightened as he saw her. "Oh, I say," he began, I didn't know it was you. This place is so crowded tonight, and I'm in such a hurry to see the humans fed. I'm afraid I didn't look where I was going. Come along. You oughtn't to miss it." "You know, perhaps," said Jane politely, "you'd show us the way?" She was a little uncertain of the lion, but seemed kindly enough. And after all, she thought, everything is topsy-turvy tonight. "Delighted," said the lion in a rather mincing voice, and he offered her his arm. She took it, but to be on the safe side, she kept Michael right beside her. He was such a round, fat little boy, and after all, she thought, lions are lions. "Does my mane look nice?" said the lion as they moved on. "I had it curled for the occasion." Jane looked at it. She could see it had been carefully oiled and combed into ringlets. "Very," she said, "but isn't it rather odd for a lion to care about such things? I thought—" "What, my dear lady," said the lion, "as you know, is the king of beasts. He has to remember his position. and I, personally, am not likely to forget. I believe a lion should always look his best, no matter where he is. Now this way." And with a grace wave of his forepaw, he pointed towards the big cat house and ushered them into the entrance. Jane and Michael caught their breaths at the sight that met their eyes. The great hall was thronged with animals. Some were leaning over the long bar that separated from the cages. Some were standing on the seats that rose in tiers opposite. There were panthers and leopards, wolves, tigers, antelopes, monkeys, hedgehogs, wombats, mountain goats, and giraffes, and an enormous group composed entirely of kittiwakes and vultures. "Splendid, isn't it?" said the lion proudly. "Just like dear old jungle days. But come along, we must get good places." He pushed his way through the crowd, crying, "Gangway, gangway!" and dragging Jane and Michael after him. Presently, through a clearing in the clattering crowd in the middle of the hall, they were able to get a glimpse of the cages. "Why," said Michael, opening his mouth wide, "they're full of humans!" And they were. In one cage, 2 large middle-aged gentlemen in top hats and striped trousers were prowling up and down anxiously, gazing through the bars as if they were waiting for something. Children of all shapes and sizes, from babies in long clothes upwards, were scrambling about in another cage. The animals outside regarded each of these with great interest, and some of them even tried to make the babies laugh by thrusting their paws or their tails through the bars. A giraffe stretched its long neck out over the heads of the other animals and let a little boy in a sailor suit tickle its nose. In a third cage, three elderly ladies in raincoats and galoshes were imprisoned. One of them was knitting, but the other 2 were standing near the bars shouting at the animals and poking them with their umbrellas. "Nasty brutes, go away, I want my tea," said one of them. "Isn't she funny?" said one of the animals, and they laughed loudly at her. "Admiral Boom," said Jane, looking surprised. And Admiral Boom it was. He was ramping up and down in his cage, coughing and blowing his nose and sputtering with rage. "Blast my gizzard! All hands to the pump! Land ho! Heave away there! Blast my gizzard!" shouted the Admiral. Every time he came near the bars, a tiger prodded him gently with a stick, and this made Admiral Boom swear dreadfully. "But how did they get in there?" said Jane to the lion. "Lost," said the lion, "or rather left behind. These are the people who've dwaddled and been left inside when the gates were shut. Gotta put 'em somewhere, so we keep 'em here. He's dangerous, that one. Nearly did for his keeper not long ago. Don't go near him," and he pointed at Admiral Boom. "Stand back, please, stand back. Don't crush. Make way, please." Jane and Michael could hear several voices crying with these words loudly. "Ah, now they're going to be fed," said the lion, excitedly pressing forward in the crowd. "Here come the keepers." 4 brown bears were wearing a peaked cap, trundling trolleys of food along a little corridor that separated the animals from the cages. "Stand back there," they yelled whenever an animal got in the way. Then they opened the small door in each cage and thrust food through on pronged forks. Jane and Michael had a good view of what was happening through a gap between a panther and a dingo. Bottles of milk were being thrown into the babies, who made soft little grabs with their hands and clutched them greedily. The other children snatched sponge cakes and donuts from other forks and began to eat ravenously. Plates of thin bread and butter and wholesome scones were provided for ladies in galoshes, and the men in top hats had lamb cutlets and custard in glasses. These, as they received their food, took it away in a corner, spread handkerchiefs over their striped trousers, and began to eat. Presently, as the keepers passed down the line of cages, a great commotion was heard. "Blast my vitals! Call that meal! A skimpy little round of beef and a couple of cabbages? What? No Yorkshire pudding? Outrageous! Up with the anchor! And where's my port? Port, I say! Heave her over! Below there, where's that Admiral's port?" "Listen to him. He turned nasty, I tell you. He's not safe, that one," said the lion. Jane and Michael didn't need to be told whom he meant. They knew Admiral Boom's language too well. "Well," said the lion, as the noise in the hall grew less uproarious, "that appears to be the end, and I'm afraid, if you'll excuse me, I must be getting along. See you later at the Grand Chain, I hope. I'll look for you." And leading them to the door, he took his leave of them, sliding away, swinging his curled mane. His golden body dappled with moonlight and shadow. "Oh, please," Jane called after him, but he was out of hearing. "I wanted to ask if they'd ever get out. The poor humans. Why, it might have been John and Barbara or any of us, too." She turned to Michael, but found that he was no longer at her side. He had moved away along one of the paths, and running after him, she found him talking to a penguin who was standing in the middle of a path with a large copybook under one wing and an enormous pencil in the other. He was biting the end of it thoughtfully as she approached. "I can't think," she heard Michael saying, apparently answering a question. The penguin turned to Jane. "Perhaps you can tell me," he said. "Now, what rhymes with Mary? I can't use contrary because that's been done before, and one must be original. If you're going to say fairy, don't. I've thought of that already, but it's not a bit like her. It won't do." "Harry," said Michael brightly. Not poetic enough," said the penguin. "What about wary?" said Jane. "Well," the penguin appeared to be considering it. "It's not very good," he said. "I'm afraid I'll have to give it up. You see, I was trying to write a poem for the birthday. I thought it would be nice if I began, 'Oh, Mary, Mary,' and then I couldn't get any further. It's very annoying. They expect something learned from a penguin, and I don't want to disappoint them. Well, you mustn't keep me. I have to get on with it." And with that he hurried away, biting his pencil and bending over his copybook. "This is all very confusing," said Jane. "Whose birthday is it, I wonder? Now, come along, you two, come along. You want to pay your respects, I suppose. It's being the birthday and all," said a voice behind them. And turning, they saw the brown bear who had given them their tickets at the gate. "Oh, of course," said Jane, thinking it was the safest thing to say, but not knowing in the least whom they were paying their respects to. The brown bear put an arm around each of them and propelled them along the path. They could feel his warm, soft fur brushing against their bodies and hear the rumbling of his voice that it made in his stomach as he walked. Here we are," said the brown bear, stopping before a small house. The windows were all so brightly lit that if it had been moonlit night, you would have never thought the sun was shining. The bear opened the door and gently pushed the two children through it. The light dazzled them at first, but their eyes soon became accustomed to it, and they saw that they were in the snake house. All the cages were open and the snakes were out, some curled lazily into scaly knots, others slipping gently about the floor, and in the middle of the snakes, on a log that had evidently been brought from one of the cages, sat none other than Mary Poppins. Jane and Michael could hardly believe their eyes. "Couple of birthday guests, ma'am," announced the brown bear. The snake turned their head inquiringly to the children. Mary Poppins didn't move, but she spoke. "And where's your overcoat, can I ask?" she said crossly to Michael, who had no surprise at all. "And your hat and gloves," she said, turning to Jane. But before either of them had time to reply, there was a stir in the snake house. Hiss, hiss. The snakes with a soft hissing sound were rising up on end and bowing to something behind Jane and Michael. The brown bear then took off his peaked cap, and slowly Mary Poppins stood up. "My dear child, my very dear child," said a small, delicate, hissing voice, and out from the largest of cages, with a soft, slow, winding movement, a hamadryad. He slid in graceful curves past the bowing snakes and the brown bear towards Mary Poppins, and when he reached her, he raised the front half of his golden body and thrusted upwards his scaly golden hood, daintily kissing her first on the cheek and then on the other. "So," he hissed softly, "this is very pleasant indeed. It's long since your birthday fell on a full moon, my dear." He turned his head. "Be seated, my friends," he said, bowing graciously to the other snakes, who, at the word, slid reverently to the floor again, coiled themselves up, and gazed steadily at him and Mary Poppins. The snake turned to see Jane and Michael, and with a little shiver they saw his face was smaller and more widened than they'd ever seen. They took a step forward, for his curious deep eyes seemed to draw them towards him. Long and narrow they were, with a dark, sleepy look, and in the middle of that dark sleepiness, a wakeful light glittered like a jewel. "And who, may I ask, are these?" he said in a soft, terrifying voice. He looked at the children. Miss Jane Banks and Master Michael Banks, at your service, said the brown bear gruffly, as though he were half afraid. Her friends. Ah, her friends. Then they're welcome, my dears. Pray be seated. Jane and Michael feeling somehow that they were in the presence of a king, as they had not felt when they met the lion. With difficulty drew their eyes from that compelling gaze and looked around for something to sit on. The brown bear provided this by squatting down himself and offering each a furry knee. Jane said in a whisper, He talks as though he were a great lord. He is. He's the lord of our world, said the bear. The wisest, most terrible of us all, said the brown bear softly. The snake smiled a long, slow, secret smile and turned to Mary. Cousin, he began hissing. Is she really his cousin? Said Michael. First cousin once removed on the mother's side, said the brown bear. He was whispering the information behind his paw. But listen now, he's going to give the birthday present. Cousin, said the snake, it's a long since your birthday fell on a full moon, and long since we've been able to celebrate the event as we celebrate it tonight. I have therefore had time to give the question of your birthday present some consideration. And I have decided, he paused, and there was no sound in the snake house but the sound of many creatures all holding their breath, that I cannot do better than give you one of my own skins. Indeed, cousin, it's too kind of you, began Mary Poppins, but the snake held up its hood for silence. Not at all, not at all. You know that I've changed my skin from time to time, and that one or more or less means little to me. Am I not, he paused to look around him, the lord of the jungle? Hissed all the snakes in the unison as though the question and answer were part of a well-known ceremony. The snake nodded. So, he said, what seems good to me will seem so to you. It's a small enough gift, dear Mary, but it may serve for a belt or a pair of shoes, even a hat band. These things always come in useful, you know. And with that he began to sway gently from side to side, and it seemed to Jane and Michael that they watched, little waves running up his body from the tail to head, giving him a long, twisting corkscrew leap, and his golden outer layer laid on the floor, and in its place he was wearing a new coat of shining silver. Wait, said the snake, as Mary Poppins bent to pick it up. I will write a greeting upon it. And he began to run his tail very quickly along his thrown skin, deftly bent the golden sheath into a circle, and dividing his head, threw it as though it were a crown, offering it graciously to Mary. She took it, bowing. I just can't thank you enough, she began, and she paused. She was evidently very pleased, for she kept running the skin backwards and forwards through her fingers and looking at it. Don't try, said the snake. Hiss, he went on, and he spread out his hood as though he were listening to it. Do I not hear the signal for the grand chain? Everybody listened. A bell was ringing, and a deep, gruff voice could be heard coming nearer and nearer, crying out, Grand chain! Grand chain! Everybody to the center for the grand chain and finale! Come along! Come along! Stand ready for the grand chain! I thought so, said the snake, smiling. You must be off, my dear. They'll be waiting for you to take your place in the center. Farewell until your next birthday. And he raised himself as though he had done before, and lightly saluted Mary Poppins on both cheeks. Hurry away, said the snake. I'll take care of your friends. Jane and Michael felt the brown bear moving under them, and they stood. Past their feet they could feel all snakes slipping and writhing as they hurried from the snake house. Mary Poppins bowed towards the snake very ceremoniously, and without a backwards glance at the children, went running towards the huge green square in the center of the zoo. You may leave us, said the snake to the brown bear, who after bowing humbly ran off with his cap in his hand to where all the other animals were congregating around Mary Poppins. Will you go with me, said the snake kindly to Jane and Michael, and without waiting for them to reply, he slid between them, and with a movement of his hood directed them to walk on either side of him. It has begun, he said, hissing with pleasure. And from the loud cries that were now coming from the green, the children could guess that he meant the grand chain. As they drew near, they could hear the animals singing and shouting, and presently They saw leopards and lions, beavers, camels, bears, cranes, antelopes, and many others, all forming themselves into a ring around Mary Poppins. Then the animals began to move, wildly crying their jungle songs, prancing in and out of the ring, and exchanging hand and wing as they went, as dancers do in the grand chain of lancers. A little pipping voice rose high above the rest. "Oh, Mary, Mary, she's my dearie-o!" And they saw that the penguins came dancing by, waving short wings and singing lustily. He caught sight of them, bowed to the hammeride, and called out, "I've got it! Did you hear me singing? It's not perfect, of course. Dearie does not rhyme exactly with Mary, but it'll do." And he skipped off and offered his wing to the leopard. Jane and Michael watched the dance as the snake's secret and still between them. As their friend the lion, dancing past, bent down to take a wing of a Brazilian pheasant in his paw, Jane shyly tried to put her feelings into words. "I thought, sir," she began and stopped, feeling confused and not sure whether she ought to say it or not. "Speak, my child," said the snake. "You thought?" "Well, that lions and birds and tigers and little animals—" The snake helped her. "You thought that they were natural enemies, that the lion could not meet a bird without eating it, or a tiger the hare. Isn't that right?" Jane blushed and then nodded. "Ah, you might be right. It is possible, but not on the birthday," said the snake. "Tonight the small are free from the great, and the great protect the small. Even I," he paused and seemed to be thinking deeply, "even I can meet a barnacle goose without any thought of dinner on this occasion. And after all," he went on, flicking his terrible forked tongue in and out as he spoke, "it may be that to eat and to be eaten are the same thing. My wisdom tells me that this is probably so. We are all made of same stuff. Remember, we are the jungle, you of the city. The same substance composes us. The tree overhead, the stone beneath us, the bird, the beast, the star. We're all one, all moving to the same end. And remember that when you no longer remember me, my child—" "But how can tree be stone? A bird is not me. Jane is not a tiger," said Michael stoutly. "You think not," said the snake's hissing voice. "Look." And he had nodded his head towards the moving mass of creatures before them. Birds and animals were now swaying together, closely encircling Mary Poppins, who was rocking lightly side to side. Backwards and forwards went the swaying crowd, keeping time together, swinging like a pendulum of a clock. Even the trees were bending and lifting gently, and the moon seemed to be rocking in the sky as the ship rocks in the sea. "Bird and beast, and stone and star, we are all one," murmured the snake, softly folding his hood about him as he himself swayed with the children. "Children and serpent, star and stone, all one." The hissing voice grew softer. The cries of the swaying animals dwindled and became fainter. Jane and Michael, as they listened, felt themselves gently rocking too, as if they were being rocked. Soft shade fell on their faces. "Asleep and dreaming, both of them," said a whispering voice. Was it the voice of the snake, or their mother's voice as she tucked them in, or her unusual nightly round the nursery? "Good," was the brown bear's gruffy voice speaking. Or was it Mr. Banks? Jane and Michael, rocking and swaying, couldn't tell. They couldn't tell. "I had such a strange dream last night," said Jane as she sprinkled sugar over her porridge at breakfast. "I dreamed we were in a zoo, and it was Mary Poppins' birthday, and instead of animals in cages, there were humans behind, and all the animals were outside." "Why, that was my dream! I dreamed that too," said Michael. He was looking very surprised. "We can't have both dreamed the same thing," said Jane. "Are you sure? Do you remember the lion who curled his mane, and the seal who wanted us to—" "Dive for an orange peel," said Michael. "Of course I do. And the babies inside the cage, and the penguin who couldn't find a rhyme, and the snake—" "Then it couldn't have been a dream at all," said Jane. "It must have been true, and if it was—" She looked curiously at Mary Poppins, who was boiling the milk. "Mary Poppins," she said, "could Michael and I have had the same dream?" "You and your dreams," said Mary Poppins, sniffing. "Eat your porridge, please, or you will have buttered toast instead." But Jane would not be put off. She had to know. "Mary Poppins," she said, looking at her harder, "were you at the zoo last night?" Mary Poppins' eyes popped. "At the zoo? In the middle of the night? Me? A quiet, orderly person who knows that early
that early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise? But were you? Said Jane, persisting. I have all I need of zoos in the nursery, thank you, said Mary Poppins. Hyenas, orangutans, all of you. Sit up straight, and no more nonsense. Jane poured out her milk. Then it must have been a dream, she said, after all. But Michael was staring mouth open at Mary Poppins, who was now making toast at the fire. Jane, he said in a shrill whisper. Jane, look! He pointed, and Jane saw it too. What he was looking at. Around her waist, Mary Poppins was wearing a belt made of golden scaly snakeskin, and on it was written in curving snaky writing, a present from the zoo. That's the end of chapter 10. We only have a couple of chapters left, so I will see you next time for our last couple chapters. Bye, Broncos.